Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to my channel, I Hate Rock Music. And this video is going to be about the band Stud. And there's actually two bands called Stud. One is an obscure American band from the mid 70s, had an independent record out, and I'll be doing a video on that. But this is a band that's Anglo-Irish called Stud that came out in 71. And one of the things that's notable about them is they were started out as a trio and then they became a quartet. And they kind of have two personalities. But the band is most notable to me anyway because the rhythm section of Taste. And of course, Taste broke up in 1970. This rhythm section really had problems with Rory Gallagher getting all the attention. And Rory just got tired of the internal struggles about that. So they ended up breaking up in 1970, and John Wilson and Charlie McCracken on bass and guitar, bass and drums, um, ended up in this new band Stud, and I think they had something to prove. Um, probably, probably. Well, I know they were disappointed when they got booted out of Taste, and then Rory Gallagher went solo, so they had a bone to pick, and so they picked Jim Cregan on guitar, who used to be in the British band Blossom Toes, and so they put out their first album in 1971 on Darum, and so they got onto a major label. And interestingly enough, it's got one cover in the UK and a different cover on Polydor, Germany. And frankly, I prefer the German cover, although they have the same theme with a horse on the cover. And there's also a Beat Club appearance, but that hasn't shown up anywhere before. I hope it shows up at some point. I'd really like to see what these guys were like live. And so that first album is a stunner. It kind of reminds me of Pato in some ways because there's a lot of really killer guitar work and a lot of open improvisation and some jazz elements. But there's some really long stuff on there where they do a lot of improvisation. And I have to say that in the short time between the last Taste album and this band Stud, that rhythm section really stepped up to the plate. They are killer, just a killer rhythm section. They deliver and fire on all pistons. And Jim Cregan is a really excellent guitar player too. So they really put it together after Taste was over, and that first record is really the mother lode. And as usual, the link will be posted below, so check it out. But it didn't sell at all, so Darum dropped the band. But they were really popular in Germany, so they ended up getting signed by BASF label. And so it's too bad. I'm surprised that Stud didn't do a lot better because it's a really great record. And it's another one of those records that took me a lot of years to get, but it really is the best of the batch. But so they kind of, I think they reeled from the bad reception of the first album and totally changed their sound. So they added John Weeder on guitar and violin, and he used to be in Eric Burdon and the Animals, and then had a point where he was in Family as well, which is interesting because Jim Cregan actually ended up in Family at one point after Stud. But the first record I heard by Stud was actually their second album from 1972 on BASF called September. And they radically overhauled their sound. It became more of a classic British rock band with some progressive tendencies, some folk tendencies, and a really solid group and really good listen. And the more you listen to the record, the better it gets, but it's certainly not as striking as the first album and a completely different direction. But John Weeder adds a lot of, or wider, ends up contributing some great violin and second guitar. And so that was it until they released one final record on BASF called Goodbye, live at Command, and it was issued after they broke up. And it's a pretty solid record. It's the second version of the band, and what they pull off live is pretty interesting. There's one track that even has a full string quartet on. I was actually kind of surprised that it was a live track because it sounds like it was done in the studio, and string quartet really adds a lot to it. But there's a couple of long improvisations on the record that kind of smack of the first album, and so they continued to be a live band that delivered a lot of fire and improvisation on stage, but they just didn't do much of that in the studio anymore. And in the last 10 or 20 years, I'm not sure when this record came out, there's one last record called Live at SWF in 1972, and I think that was a German program. And once again, it shows the second version of the band, and like the other live record, it's a very uh, interesting combination of more rural tunes, almost country, and then some semi-progressive stuff, and then some great jams. I'm glad to have it. I wish a live record would come out of the first version of the band, but that said, we have two studio albums and two live albums from this band, and they're very, very, very satisfying. The first record is essential, and I like having the other records in my collection because they are a really cool band. They've got a great pedigree, and as I mentioned, the rhythm section from Taste is outstanding, and both Jim Cregan and John Whiter are excellent. And John Whiter also ended up in a band called Moonrider at one point that put out one album, so I'll probably be doing a video by them. But Jim Cregan joined Family in 1972 and ended up playing with Cockney Rebel and Rod Stewart as well. Charlie McCracken ended up with the Spencer Davis Group, and then interestingly enough, the group Fastway, which was a UFO spinoff, and then Wilson and Bruce Shields had a version of Skid Row in 1975. So interesting that those Irish guys would connect again and have this new band. But as I mentioned, like some of these bands, sometimes it can be a mixed bag, and they change their identities from record to record. And this band Stud is definitely a striking example of that. The first album being sprawling with a lot of improvisation and long jams and everything else, and then they tightened everything up and became a lot more song oriented with a lot more textures and a lot more instruments added, and but pretty solid work. It almost sounds like two different bands, but the fact that they did have so much variety over their two studio albums kind of makes them a little more interesting. But as I mentioned, it would have been nice to have a second album by the original trio because that's where the money is. So there you have it, Stud, pretty obscure band. I know their records go for pretty good dough now, and have gotten pretty hard to find. And I managed to pick up a couple of them in the middle '70s, and then I've never owned a copy of the first album, and I'd like to get one. I'd like to add it to my collection now because it's so killer. So, as a 50-year-long record collector, it's kind of fun that there's still some rarities out there that have eluded me for 5 decades. So anyway, I'll put the links below. Check them out. Definitely start with the first album. Get your blood flow going, and then sit back in an easy chair, smoke some weed, and check out the second record, and be surprised that it's the same band. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.